I sat at the long dining table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, pretending to be invisible. The table glittered with silverware and crystal glasses, the kind of dinner my daughter-in-law loved to host. She thrived on appearances, every plate perfectly aligned, every napkin folded with crisp precision. And I, as always, was seated at the far end, as if I didn't quite belong. The chatter of guests filled the room, polite laughter echoing against the high ceilings. My son sat at the head of the table, chest puffed with pride, introducing his colleagues and their wives. His wife, Clara, floated around the table like she was born for this stage, her pearls shimmering under the chandelier. I was quiet. I usually was. Years of keeping the peace had taught me that silence was safer than words. But silence did not shield me from what was about to happen. "Who prepared this roast?" one of the guests asked, cutting into the tender slice of meat on his plate. Clara smiled sweetly, placing her manicured hand on her husband's shoulder. "Oh, I planned everything, of course. But I had help." Her eyes flicked toward me. I felt my cheeks warm as I looked up from my plate. "She's our maid," Clara announced with a laugh that was light, but sharp enough to cut through bone. "She practically lives here, don't you?" The room erupted in polite chuckles. Some glanced at me, others avoided my eyes altogether. My fork trembled in my hand. Maid. That word. I wasn't their maid. I was his mother. But Clara had erased that truth with one cruel word. And my son, he said nothing. He didn't correct her, didn't defend me, didn't even look my way. He just kept smiling, raising his glass to toast with his boss. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing louder than the laughter around me. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to swallow the bitterness. I told myself I could endure it. I had endured worse. Still, I felt myself shrinking inside, folding into the shadow of the chair as whispers passed through the table. "Oh, how lucky," one woman murmured, "to have such loyal help." I pressed my palms together under the table, gripping them so tightly my knuckles ached. I remembered the nights I stayed awake counting pennies, the mornings I went hungry so my son could eat, the years of scrubbing, sewing, and saving. I wasn't a maid. I was the reason this house even stood, yet there I was, dismissed with one cruel label, reduced to a servant in front of strangers. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout the truth, that the food they praised came from recipes I had taught Clara, that the house they admired existed because of me. But my lips stayed sealed. Not yet, I thought. Clara continued to glide through the evening, her laughter like a bell, her hands brushing her husband's arm, her voice louder than everyone else's. She was the star of the show, and I was the invisible stagehand. The meal went on, but every bite I swallowed tasted like ash. I heard Maid over and over in my mind, each repetition digging deeper, stripping away every ounce of dignity I had left. By dessert, my decision was made. If they wanted a show tonight, I would give them one, but not the one Clara had planned. I straightened in my chair, my eyes sweeping the table, memorizing every face, every guest, every smirk, every silent accomplice. They didn't know it yet, but tonight, the truth would be served alongside Clara's perfect crème brûlée. And when it came, no one in this room would laugh. As I sat at that dinner table, surrounded by polished silverware and hollow laughter, my mind drifted back to the years that had brought me here. People saw me now as a quiet old woman in the corner, someone easy to dismiss, someone who could be called a maid without question. But they didn't know my story. They didn't know the price I had paid for every brick of this house. I was 21 when I married. Life back then was not easy, but we had dreams. My husband and I believed that with enough hard work, we could build something that would last. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and we had our son. He was the light of my life. Every choice I made, every sacrifice, every tear shed in silence was for him. My husband worked long hours, but jobs were scarce and wages were small. There were nights when he came home exhausted, his hands blistered, his eyes clouded with worry. I tried to be strong for him. I stretched every dollar until it screamed. I took in sewing from neighbors, mended clothes until my eyes ached, and cooked meals that could feed 3 people with the price of 1. When my husband died unexpectedly, I thought my world had ended. I was still young, but I felt old overnight. The grief nearly crushed me, but I had no choice. I couldn't collapse. I had a child to raise. My son was only 7 then. He didn't understand why his father wasn't coming home. He clung to me, and I promised him, through my tears, that I would take care of everything. And I did. I worked in kitchens, I scrubbed floors, I washed dishes in restaurants where no one knew my name. I carried trays heavier than my body could handle. My back bent, my hands roughened, but I endured. Every time I thought I couldn't go on, I looked at my son and found the strength to keep moving. He never saw the hunger I carried in my belly when I gave him the last piece of bread. He never knew how many nights I stayed awake stitching clothes by candlelight so he could have school books. He never knew that I pawned my wedding ring to pay for his first college semester. I gave and gave and gave. And I did it with love. So when he grew older, when he found success, when he married Clara, I told myself it was all worth it. He had become the man I had prayed he would be. I thought maybe finally I could rest. Maybe I could sit at a dinner table as his mother, not his servant, not his shadow, but the woman who had carried him through storms. But Clara never saw me that way. From the day she entered our lives, she made it clear I was a burden. My plain clothes embarrassed her. My accent, my old-fashioned habits, the way I prayed before meals, all of it became something for her to roll her eyes at. I tried to ignore it. I reminded myself she was young, that maybe time would soften her. But time only sharpened her tongue. Little comments at first. "Oh, you don't understand how we do things," or "You're old-fashioned." Then bigger insults. "You're lucky we let you stay here." I endured it, because of my son. He seemed happy and I didn't want to disturb his peace. But every insult cut deeper. Every dismissal reminded me that in Clara's eyes I was not a mother. I was staff, and yet, she didn't know. She didn't know that when their finances were crumbling, when they faced losing this very house, it was me who stepped in. She didn't know about the mortgage payments I made behind the scenes, the checks I wrote, the savings I emptied. She thought she was the queen of this castle, but the truth was, I was the one who kept the castle standing. Sitting at that dinner table, I felt all those years of sacrifice swell inside me like a tide. For decades, I had given everything quietly, invisibly, without recognition. But tonight, when she called me a maid in front of strangers, something in me snapped. This was no longer about pride. It was about truth. And if Clara wanted to put on a performance tonight, she was about to meet the real playwright. Looking back now, I realize the signs were always there. Clara's cruelty didn't appear overnight. It dripped in slowly, like water wearing away at stone, until one day I was drowning in it. I still remember the first dinner I attended after she married my son. I had worn my best dress, a simple navy blue one I had saved for years. I tied my hair back neatly and even dabbed a little perfume on my wrist. I wanted to look respectable, to make my son proud, to show Clara that I was someone worth welcoming into her new family. But the moment I walked into their living room, Clara's eyes slid over me like I was a stain on the carpet. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh," she said, tilting her head as if she were studying me under a microscope. "You didn't have to dress up. We're just casual here." Her words were harmless on the surface, but her tone cut deep. I looked around the room. Everyone else wore crisp shirts and elegant dresses. Casual? No, I was the only one underdressed by her standards. My son said nothing, just placed his hand on her back and guided her toward the kitchen. That was the first time I felt it. That sharp sting of being less than, of being tolerated instead of embraced. After that, the comments became frequent. One morning, as I ironed my son's shirts, Clara breezed past me with her coffee cup. "You know," she said with a laugh, "if you weren't around, we'd probably have to hire help." She sipped her drink, not even looking at me. I guess you save us some money. I stood there holding the iron, the steam hissing like the words I wanted to say but swallowed back. Another time, when her friends visited, she introduced me not as her mother-in-law, but as the one who helps out around the house. I forced a smile while her friends nodded politely, their eyes already glazing over, uninterested in me. Every insult was wrapped in a smile, every dismissal disguised as a joke. And my son, my own flesh and blood, never corrected her. He would laugh awkwardly, change the subject, or pretend he hadn't heard. The worst part wasn't Clara's words. It was his silence. I told myself she didn't mean it. That maybe I was being sensitive. That if I stayed quiet, things would get better. But they didn't. Silence only gave her more power. The first red flag became a field of them, waving in every direction. When guests came over, she would place me in the kitchen. "You don't mind helping with the dishes, do you?" she'd say, already walking away. If I protested, she'd tilt her head, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Oh, but you're so good at it." Better than me. When the family took vacations, she'd leave me behind. "Someone has to watch the house," she'd say with a laugh, as though I should be grateful to sit alone in empty rooms while they enjoyed the beach. It became clear to me that Clara didn't see me as family. She saw me as furniture, useful, quiet, and easily ignored. But I endured. I endured because I loved my son. I endured because I told myself love meant sacrifice, and maybe one day he would open his eyes and see the truth. What I didn't know then was that endurance has a breaking point. And Clara was marching me toward mine, one cruel word at a time. At that dinner table, when she called me a maid in front of her guests, it wasn't an isolated insult. It was the climax of years of little cuts, of red flags I had ignored, of a silence that had cost me my dignity. That night, my silence ended. The dinner that changed everything didn't come out of nowhere. Clara had been planning it for weeks, maybe even months. She lived for these kinds of nights, nights when the house could shine, when her friends and my son's colleagues could walk away impressed. It wasn't just about food or company for her. It was about performance. For days leading up to it, the house buzzed with preparation. Clara ordered flowers that arrived in tall, glossy boxes, their stems wrapped in delicate paper. She arranged them meticulously, cutting each stem at an angle, placing them in crystal vases that caught the light just so. She bought new curtains, new china, even a new dress for herself. Everything had to be perfect, down to the smallest detail. And me? I was the detail. "You'll help with the cooking, won't you?" Clara said in that sing-song tone that always sounded like a question, but wasn't. "You're so much better in the kitchen than I am." She didn't mean it as a compliment. It was her way of assigning me a role, so I chopped vegetables until my hands ached. I marinated meat, kneaded bread, polished silverware until I could see my reflection in the spoons. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, unacknowledged but essential. Every now and then, my son would pass through, kiss Clara on the cheek, tell her she was amazing. He didn't notice me bent over the stove, sweat dripping down my back, my apron damp from hours of labor. If he did, he said nothing. The morning of the dinner, Clara floated around the house like a queen awaiting her coronation. She barked small orders. Straighten that rug, move that chair, polish those glasses again. Always directed at me, never at herself. She didn't lift a finger except to check her reflection in the mirror or adjust her pearl necklace. By the afternoon, the table was set like something from a magazine. White linens, gold-rimmed plates, candles in tall holders that would glow softly as the night wore on. She placed name cards at each setting, written in her careful looping script. I noticed mine was at the far end of the table, almost in the shadows, as though I didn't quite belong in the light. When the guests began to arrive, the house transformed. Laughter echoed in the hallway, heels clicked on the polished floors, coats rustled as they were hung up. Clara greeted everyone with wide smiles and air kisses, her voice lilting with false warmth. "Welcome, welcome. Come in, so glad you could make it." I stood back, invisible. Just like she wanted. I watched as she paraded our home like it was her stage. "Oh, we just had the curtains redone," she said proudly, brushing her fingers against the fabric. And this table? Imported, of course. Not once did she mention the sacrifices that had made it all possible. The mortgage payments I had quietly shouldered. The debts I had erased. The years of labor that had gone into keeping this house from slipping away. But I stayed silent. I set out dishes, refilled glasses, and smiled politely when someone happened to glance my way. No one questioned who I was. Clara made sure of that. To them, I was just the help, and maybe, until that night, I had accepted it. Maybe I had believed that silence was strength, that keeping peace was better than causing conflict. But as the night wore on, as the conversations grew louder, as the laughter swelled, I felt something inside me tighten. I wasn't angry yet. Not fully, but I was restless. A storm was gathering in me, waiting for the spark. And then, as dessert was served, Clara gave me that spark. She looked at me with her perfectly painted smile, tilted her head in that familiar, cruel way, and said the words that shattered every ounce of patience I had left. "She's our maid. She practically lives here, don't you?" The room laughed. My son stayed silent, and I began to burn. It wasn't the first time Clara had said it, but it was the first time she'd said it so boldly, so publicly, with such deliberate cruelty. And in that instant, something inside me snapped. I sat perfectly still, fork poised above my plate, though I had no appetite left. My face felt hot, my palms slick with sweat. The room around me blurred as laughter bubbled at the table, polite chuckles from guests who didn't know any better, who thought it was just a harmless joke. But it wasn't harmless. It was humiliation. I glanced at my son, praying for him to speak, to correct her, to say, "This is my mother." But he didn't. His eyes darted toward his boss, and he forced a laugh, raising his glass to toast. That silence, his silence, was louder than any insult Clara could throw. Something inside me twisted. All those years of sacrifice, of swallowing my pride, of staying quiet for the sake of peace, they rose up like a tide, drowning me in bitterness. I heard my husband's voice in my memory, the promises we had whispered to each other late at night when we dreamed of a better life. And here I was, stripped of my dignity, reduced to nothing but a servant in my own son's home. No, not tonight. I took a slow breath, my fingers tightening around my napkin. I forced myself to meet Clara's eyes. She was laughing, her shoulders shaking delicately, as though she had just delivered the punchline of a perfect joke. Around the table, forks clinked, glasses sparkled, and conversation shifted. Yet I sat frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. A voice inside me whispered, "Enough." I had endured the little cuts for years. The side comments, the dismissals, the constant erasure of everything I had given. I had endured it for my son, because I thought my silence was love. But what good was love if it allowed people to trample your dignity? I thought of the mortgage papers tucked safely away in my room upstairs, proof of every payment I had made to save this house when they were drowning in debt. Proof that I wasn't the maid, I was the lifeline. Proof that without me, their perfect little world would have crumbled long ago. The urge to stand up then and there, to lay the papers out on the table and watch their smug faces crumble, was overwhelming. But I didn't move, not yet. The storm inside me was gathering strength, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Instead, I sat straighter in my chair, my expression calm, almost serene. I let Clara see nothing but stillness in my face. That was the first crack in her performance. She expected me to laugh awkwardly, to bow my head, to disappear into the shadows as I always had. But I didn't. I met her gaze, steady and unblinking, until she finally looked away. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I barely tasted the food. I barely heard the chatter around me. All I could hear was that word echoing in my skull, "Maid, maid, maid." By the time dessert was cleared, my decision was made. I would not let Clara erase me. I would not let my son's silence bury me. Tonight, the truth would come out, not in anger, not in screaming, but in a calm, undeniable revelation. I would let Clara bask in her false glory just a little longer. I would let her think she had won. And then, when she least expected it, I would tear down the stage she had built and reveal who the real owner of this house was. As the guests rose from the table, moving toward the parlor for coffee and conversation, I followed silently, my hands folded in front of me. I could feel the documents in my mind like a hidden weapon, ready and waiting. The performance wasn't over. But the ending wouldn't belong to Clara. It would belong to me. Long before that dinner party, long before Clara's cruel words echoed through the dining room, there had been another night. A night when this very house teetered on the edge of being lost forever. I remember it clearly. I was in the kitchen late one evening when I overheard them whispering. My son's voice was low, urgent, his words heavy with fear. Clara's voice was sharp, brittle, the sound of someone who cared more about appearances than reality. "We're 3 months behind," he said, his hands running through his hair. "If we don't catch up, they'll start foreclosure proceedings." "What do you mean we're behind?" Clara snapped. "You told me the promotion would cover this. How can we host parties or have people over if we lose this house?" Her panic was not about losing a roof over their heads. It was about losing face, about losing the shiny mask she wore for the world. I stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the edge of the wall as I listened. My heart ached for my son. I knew how hard he worked, how much pressure he was under to provide, to succeed. But I also knew what they didn't. I had been saving quietly for years. Every small job I had taken, every penny I had pinched, every luxury I denied myself, it had all gone into a little envelope tucked away in my drawer. It wasn't much. Not compared to what they owed. But it was something. That night, after they went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my small box of savings. My hands trembled as I counted the bills, the coins, the sacrifices of a lifetime. I thought of the long shifts I had worked, the meals I had skipped, the clothes I had mended instead of replacing. And then I thought of my son, the little boy who used to run into my arms after school, who once told me he wanted to buy me a big house one day so I would never have to worry again. He had forgotten that promise. But I hadn't. The next morning, I walked into the bank with my savings, every last penny. It wasn't enough to cover the debt, but it was enough to prove commitment. Enough to buy time. I signed papers I barely understood, adding my name where it had not been before. The banker looked at me with surprise. This gray-haired woman in worn shoes, offering to take on a burden that wasn't hers. But it was mine. Because it was my son's. From that day on, the mortgage became my shadow. Every month I paid quietly without their knowledge. Sometimes it meant giving up medicine I needed. Sometimes it meant wearing the same old shoes until the soles wore thin. But I never missed a payment. Not once. When they redecorated the living room, I smiled, knowing it was my money that kept those walls standing. When they bought Clara a new car, I bit my tongue, reminding myself that if I could keep the roof over their heads, then maybe they could live the life I had always wanted for them. They never asked how the bills got caught up. They never wondered why the foreclosure notices stopped arriving. Clara simply carried on, hosting parties, redecorating, living in the illusion that my son's salary alone kept them afloat. But I knew, and I kept every receipt, every statement, every piece of paper that showed where the money came from. Proof of my sacrifice, proof of my role, proof that I wasn't just living here, I was keeping them alive here. So when Clara called me a maid at that dinner table, when she reduced me to nothing more than a servant in front of her glittering guests, I felt the weight of those papers burning in my memory. I was no maid. I was the true keeper of this house, the silent foundation under their lives, the woman who had paid the price so they could sit at that glittering table without fear of losing everything. And soon, very soon, the world would know it. The dinner table shimmered with crystal glasses and polished silverware, but the air was thick, heavy with unspoken truths. My son sat stiffly at the head of the table, forcing smiles, trying to keep the evening flowing. Clara sparkled in her seat, her voice carrying louder than anyone else's, as if she were auditioning for a role she desperately needed the world to believe. I sat quietly, folding my napkin on my lap, my hands trembling ever so slightly. The weight of years pressed against my chest. The years of sacrifice, the years of silence, the years of pretending that I didn't see or hear the barbs hidden in Clara's words. And then she said it. "She doesn't really live here," Clara announced with a smile that was sharp as a blade. "She just helps around like a maid. Isn't that right?" Her laughter rang out, false and cutting. Some of the guests chuckled nervously, others looked down at their plates, embarrassed. But not one person spoke up for me, not even my son. He stared at his plate, his jaw tight, his fork motionless. For a moment, I thought I might crumble. My heart thudded in my chest, my face burned with humiliation. But then another feeling rose, stronger than shame, fiercer than hurt. It was anger. Not the wild, uncontrollable kind, but the steady, righteous kind that had been simmering in me for years. I placed my napkin on the table, my movements deliberate, unhurried. The sound of fabric brushing against the china was louder than the laughter that had filled the room seconds before. One by one, heads turned toward me. "Clara," I said softly, but my voice carried. The room grew silent. "Do you really believe that?" Her smile faltered for just a second, then snapped back into place. "Well, isn't it true? You've always helped out around the house. Helped out. As if scrubbing floors I never dirtied and cooking meals I rarely ate was the sum of my existence." I leaned forward slightly, my eyes fixed on hers. "Tell me, Clara, do you know who pays for this house?" A ripple of discomfort moved across the table. One of the guests coughed, another shifted in his chair. Clara laughed again, but it was thinner this time, weaker. "Why, my husband does, of course. Isn't that right, darling?" She reached for my son's hand, but he pulled away, his face pale. I caught the flicker in his eyes, the shame he tried to hide. He knew. Deep down, he had always known. "No," I said firmly, my voice stronger now. "He doesn't, not entirely." The silence deepened. Forks paused in midair. Glasses stopped just before lips. The only sound was the faint clinking of the chandelier above us. "What are you talking about?" Clara demanded, her smile gone, her mask slipping. I drew in a steady breath. This was the moment. The years of sacrifice, the late nights, the quiet payments, it all led here. "I'm talking about the fact," I said, letting my gaze sweep across the table, "that for years, this house has stayed standing because of me. Every mortgage payment you thought magically disappeared, every time you bragged about how well you were doing, it was me. My money, my sacrifice." Gasps broke out around the table. Someone dropped a fork. Clara's face drained of color. "That's not true," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I reached into my purse, the same purse she had mocked as outdated more than once, and pulled out a folder. I had brought it with me that night, though I hadn't been sure I'd use it. Bank statements, receipts, signed documents, all with my name, all undeniable. I laid the folder in the center of the table. "See for yourself," I said. The guests leaned in, curiosity overriding their discomfort. My son reached for the folder first, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. His eyes grew wide with each one. Finally, he looked up at me, tears glistening in his eyes. "Mom," he whispered. You did all this?" "Yes," I said simply. "While your wife paraded around, hosting dinners and buying cars, I was making sure you had a roof over your head." Clara's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood, her face twisted with fury and disbelief. "You're lying. You're trying to humiliate me." But the proof lay open on the table, undeniable, unshakable. I sat back in my chair, calm now, steady. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, and I wasn't done yet. The room felt like it had shrunk, every eye fixed on Clara as she stood trembling, her hands balled into fists at her sides. The mask she wore so carefully, the mask of wealth and control, was cracking right in front of everyone. "You're making this up," she hissed, her voice sharp, desperate. "You're old, confused. No one believes you." But even as she spoke, the papers on the table glared back at her like a spotlight. My son held them in his hands, his knuckles white, his eyes darting between the documents and his wife. He couldn't deny what was written in black and white. "Clara," he said finally, his voice hoarse, "these are bank records. Her name is right there. Every payment." His voice trailed off, heavy with realization. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to each other. One woman leaned toward her husband and muttered, "So she's the one who saved the house?" He nodded, his face grim. Clara's eyes darted around the table, searching for an ally, someone to laugh it off, to turn the tide. But no one met her gaze. "How dare you embarrass me like this?" she shouted, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "In front of everyone? You've always been jealous of me. That's what this is about, isn't it? You wanted to ruin me." I stayed calm, my hands folded neatly on the table. For years I had stayed quiet, but tonight was different. Tonight the truth had a voice. "Jealous?" I said softly but firmly. "Jealous of what? Of pretending? Of living in a house you couldn't afford without me? Of wearing clothes bought with money you didn't earn?" Gasps rippled again, sharper this time. A man at the far end of the table cleared his throat, but Clara's rage drowned everything else out. "You're just a bitter old woman," she screamed. "You should be grateful we even let you stay here. If it weren't for me, you'd be rotting away somewhere, forgotten." The words cut deep, sharper than any knife. For a moment I felt them slice into my chest. But then I remembered the nights I stayed up counting coins, the mornings I skipped meals so I could make that mortgage payment, the sacrifices I bore alone while she smiled for the world. I straightened in my chair, my voice steady and clear. "No, Clara, if it weren't for me, you wouldn't be standing in this house. None of this would exist for you. I paid for this roof. I carried this weight. Not you." My son slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the stunned silence. "Enough," he shouted. His face was flushed, his eyes wet. He looked at his wife with something I hadn't seen in years. Anger. "She's telling the truth, Clara, and I knew it deep down. I knew something wasn't right when the foreclosure letters stopped, but I let you convince me not to ask questions. And now," he broke off, shaking his head. "Now I see." Clara's face twisted, her lips trembling as if searching for another lie to hide behind. But there was nothing left. The guests sat frozen, caught between shock and fascination. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others watched like they couldn't look away from the wreckage of a car crash. Clara finally shrieked, her voice cracking. "You're humiliating me! In front of everyone I know!" But this time no one rushed to comfort her. Not a single hand reached out. She stood alone, her empire of pretense collapsing piece by piece. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes fixed on hers. "Humiliation isn't what I've given you, Clara. The truth is. And you've never been able to stand the truth." Her chair tipped as she pushed it back violently, the screech of wood on tile making everyone flinch. She stood there, chest heaving, eyes burning with hatred. "You'll regret this," she spat. "Both of you will." But her threat sounded hollow, pitiful, against the weight of the truth now laid bare for all to see. As she stormed away from the table, a heavy silence fell over the room. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The truth had shifted everything. The roles were no longer the same. For the first time, I wasn't the quiet shadow in the corner. I wasn't the maid. I was the woman who saved this family from ruin, and everyone in that room knew it. The sound of Clara's heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed down the hallway, each strike like the final beat of a war drum. Then the slam of the bedroom door reverberated through the house. Silence followed, a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls, against the hearts of everyone still sitting at that table. No one moved. No one spoke. Forks rested abandoned on half-finished plates. Wine glasses stood untouched. Eyes darted between me and my son as though they were watching a play that had just taken a dark, unexpected turn. My son sat motionless, his head in his hands, the folder of papers lying open before him like evidence in a courtroom. His face was pale, his body tense, as if the truth had knocked the wind out of him. Finally, one of the guests, a man with silver hair and a thoughtful frown, cleared his throat. "Well," he murmured, "I think we've all just witnessed something very important." His wife nodded slowly. "It takes a strong person to do what she did," she said, glancing at me. Her eyes held respect, not pity, and that alone gave me strength. Others began whispering, their voices hushed, but the words slipped into the air nonetheless. "All this time? I had no idea. She paid for the house? Unbelievable." The shame that had once belonged to me now settled squarely on Clara's shoulders, even though she had fled the room. I sat quietly, my hands folded neatly in my lap. For years I had been invisible, spoken of as if I were a burden, tolerated rather than cherished. But tonight their eyes saw me differently. I wasn't just the old woman in the house. I was the woman who had kept this family from collapsing. My son finally raised his head. His eyes were red, his jaw tight. He looked at me, not as though I were frail or weak, but as if he were seeing me for the first time in years. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me help?" I looked at him steadily, holding his gaze. "Because, my son, you already had enough weight on your shoulders. You were working, trying to provide, trying to be everything for your family. I couldn't add this burden to you. I carried it because I could. Because I had to." Tears slid down his cheeks, and he wiped them quickly, embarrassed in front of his friends. But no one judged him. Not tonight. One guest leaned forward, speaking softly but firmly. "You owe her everything. Don't ever forget that." The words hit my son harder than Clara's cruelty ever had. He nodded, swallowing hard, his eyes never leaving mine. Dinner had been ruined, but no one seemed to care about the food anymore. The night had shifted into something else entirely, an unveiling, a reckoning. Some guests made excuses to leave early, their polite farewells tinged with discomfort. Others lingered, as if reluctant to step away from the raw truth laid bare in this house. Eventually, only a few remained, sitting quietly with us in the living room, speaking in hushed tones. My son sat close beside me, his hand resting over mine, as though to anchor himself to me, to make up for the years of distance. But upstairs, behind a locked door, Clara simmered. I could feel her anger in the air, a storm gathering in silence. She would not forgive easily, not because she had been wronged, but because her pride had been shattered. And a woman like Clara, who lived for appearances, would never allow that wound to close without trying to strike back. Still, as I sat there listening to the low hum of conversation, I felt something I hadn't in years. Strength, dignity, a quiet power that came from finally being heard. For the first time, I knew that the truth was stronger than Clara's lies. Stronger than her parties, her laughter, her cruelty. And I also knew this was far from over. The storm had only just begun. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The clinking of glasses and the low murmur of embarrassed guests were gone, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural. My son sat at the breakfast table, staring into a cold cup of coffee, while I moved quietly around the kitchen, the weight of last night still hanging in the air. But Clara was not quiet for long. The bedroom door upstairs slammed open, and her footsteps thundered down the staircase. She appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled, her eyes swollen from a night of rage and tears. Yet her chin was lifted high, her voice sharp and cutting. "So," she spat, her gaze darting between me and my son, "this is what you wanted? To humiliate me? To turn everyone against me?" My son sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "Clara, stop! You embarrassed yourself. Mom only told the truth." "The truth?" Clara's laugh was brittle, empty. "The truth is that she's been scheming behind our backs, meddling in our marriage, making herself look like a savior while painting me as the villain." I set down the dish towel in my hand and faced her squarely. "I didn't have to paint you as anything, Clara. Your words last night did that for you." Her lips curled, her voice rising. "You think you've won, don't you? sitting there like some martyr, making everyone pity you. But this is my home, my reputation, and I won't let you destroy it. This isn't your home, I said calmly, though my hands trembled slightly. It never was. Without me, you wouldn't even be living here. Clara's face turned crimson, and for a moment, I thought she might strike me. Instead, she turned her fury toward my son. And you let her do this to me? You let her humiliate me in front of everyone we know? He pushed back his chair, standing tall, his voice firm in a way I hadn't heard in years. She didn't humiliate you, Clara. You did that yourself. She saved us. She saved you. And instead of being grateful, you've treated her like dirt. I'm done pretending that's okay. Clara's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with shock. Done? What are you saying? I'm saying, he said, his voice steady, that if you can't show my mother the respect she deserves, then maybe you and I don't have much left. The silence that followed was sharp, like glass shattering in slow motion. Clara's breathing quickened, her hands shaking as she pointed at me again. This is your fault. You've poisoned him against me. I stood my ground, meeting her wild gaze. No, Clara. The truth has simply opened his eyes. That's all. For the rest of the day, Clara stormed through the house like a trapped animal, slamming doors, making phone calls, her voice shrill as she ranted to anyone who would listen. I heard snippets, her mother, a friend, maybe even a lawyer. She painted herself as the victim, spinning a story where I was manipulative, conniving, ungrateful. But the problem with lies is that once the truth has been seen, it cannot be unseen. The guests from last night had already begun whispering through their social circles. The story of Clara's humiliation traveled faster than she could contain it. By evening, calls stopped coming in her favor. Friends grew distant. Her social shine was dimming, one judgmental glance at a time. At dinner, she refused to sit at the same table as me. She ate in silence upstairs, the sound of her cutlery clattering angrily against the plate. My son sat across from me, weary but resolute. She won't let this go, he murmured, his eyes heavy with worry. No, I agreed softly. She won't. Pride never dies quietly. And I was right. Over the next few days, Clara doubled down. She criticized me openly, tried to belittle me whenever my son was in the room, hoping to drive a wedge between us. She accused me of exaggerating, of manipulating the bank into giving me credit for payments I hadn't made. But every time she lashed out, my son stood firmer, his defenses stronger. For years he had been silent while she tore at me with her words. But now something had shifted. Each insult Clara hurled only brought him closer to me, further from her. She could feel it too. And that only deepened her desperation. One night, as I passed her in the hallway, she leaned close, her voice a venomous whisper. You think you've won because of some papers and a sob story? This isn't over. I'll make sure you regret the day you ever stepped foot in this house. Her words chilled me, but they didn't break me. Because I had something Clara could never understand. Truth on my side. And truth, I knew, always finds a way to win. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Days stretched into weeks, each one a battle of wills between Clara's bitterness and my quiet resolve. My son was caught in the middle, his heart pulled in two directions, between the woman he married and the mother who had sacrificed everything. But slowly, I began to see the scales tip. It started with little things. He would join me in the kitchen while I cooked, something he hadn't done in years. He began asking me about my day, about my health, listening with a kind of attentiveness that Clara never inspired. When Clara mocked my old shoes or my worn sweater, his jaw would tighten, his silence no longer one of agreement, but of disapproval. One evening, he came home from work later than usual. His tie was loose, his shoulders slumped, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Clara pounced immediately, demanding why he hadn't answered her calls, accusing him of avoiding her. He brushed past her, his eyes finding me in the kitchen. "Mom," he said softly, "can we talk?" I nodded, drying my hands and following him into the den. Clara stormed after us, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. "Don't you dare shut me out!" She snapped, but he did. For the first time, he closed the door in her face. He turned to me then, his eyes heavy with unshed tears. Mom, I've been blind. I let her treat you like nothing, and I let myself believe it was normal. I thought keeping the peace meant staying silent, but all I did was hurt you. My heart ached at his words. You were trying to survive, I said gently. I never blamed you for that. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. No, I should have seen it. I should have stopped it years ago. But I let Clara's voice drown out yours. He paused, his gaze steady now. That ends tonight. Before I could respond, the door burst open. Clara stormed in, her face flushed with fury. So this is what it's come to? She shouted. The two of you whispering behind my back, plotting against me. You're pathetic, both of you. My son turned to her, his voice firm, controlled. Enough, Clara. I've listened to you insult her for years. I've watched you belittle her, dismiss her, treat her like a burden when she's the reason we even have this home. I won't stand by anymore. Clara's eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. You're choosing her over me? She demanded, her voice trembling with rage. He didn't flinch. I'm choosing what's right. I'm choosing the truth. Her laughter came then, high-pitched and brittle. The truth? The truth is you're weak. You let your mother control you, and now you're throwing away your marriage for her. His voice rose, louder than I'd ever heard it. No, Clara. I'm ending this because you've turned our marriage into a cage. You care more about appearances than love, more about money than respect. And I can't do it anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara stared at him, stunned, as if the ground had just crumbled beneath her feet. Finally, she whispered, You'll regret this. But her words no longer carried the weight they once did. My son stood tall, resolute, unshaken. He turned to me then, his eyes softer. Mom, I want you to stay. This is your home as much as mine. Maybe even more. Emotion swelled in my chest, threatening to spill over. For so long, I had lived in the shadows, my sacrifices unseen, my worth diminished. And now, finally, the recognition I had never asked for but always deserved was here. Clara stormed out again, her threats echoing down the hallway. But something was different this time. The fear in her voice betrayed her. She knew she was losing her grip, and I knew the turning point had come. The balance had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't the outsider. I was the heart of this home. Clara's downfall didn't happen all at once. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread, until the image she had so carefully stitched together for the world fell apart in her hands. In the days that followed my son's declaration, she tried everything to claw back control. She called friends, twisting the story, painting herself as the victim of a manipulative old woman who had brainwashed her husband. But the whispers from that dinner party had already spread too far. People had seen the truth with their own eyes, the papers, the receipts, the humiliation written across Clara's face. Calls that once came with invitations grew scarce. The friends who once admired her parties began to keep their distance. The social circle she had built like a castle crumbled, leaving her stranded in the ruins of her own pride. At home, her fury only deepened. She hurled insults at me like daggers, each one bouncing off the shield I had built from years of endurance. She slammed doors, cursed under her breath, made threats about leaving, and then, one evening, she did. She packed her bags in a frenzy, dragging suitcases down the stairs, her voice rising with every slam of a drawer. I won't live in a house where I'm disrespected, she shouted, her eyes wild, her pride shattered. My son stood at the bottom of the staircase, his arms crossed, his face calm but firm. Clara, he said evenly, you've disrespected yourself. This house was never yours to begin with. Leave if you must, but know this, you're not walking away from me. You already lost me the moment you chose your pride over compassion. Her face twisted, and for a moment, I saw fear flash in her eyes. But she masked it with a laugh, brittle and hollow. You'll come crawling back, she hissed. You can't survive without me. But she was wrong. She dragged her suitcases out the door, slamming it behind her. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was light. freeing. For the first time in years, the house felt like a home. My son turned to me then, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion, but his eyes softer than I had ever seen them. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't know how to make this up to you." I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't need to. You've already taken the first step, by seeing me, by believing me, by standing up for what's right. That's enough." He pulled me into an embrace, his arms strong around me, the way he used to hold me when he was a boy. For a long moment, we stayed there in the quiet, both of us breathing a little easier, the weight finally lifting from our shoulders. In the weeks that followed, life shifted. The house was calmer, warmer. My son cooked dinner with me. We laughed more. We sat together in the evenings without Clara's sharp voice slicing through the air. Guests who had once ignored me now greeted me with respect, their eyes carrying something new, admiration. Clara, on the other hand, became a ghost in the whispers of others. Stories of her cruelty, her downfall, her pride turning to ashes followed her wherever she went. She had built her identity on appearances, and without them she had nothing left. That was her justice, not delivered by my hands but by her own choices. And me? For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not because I had won, but because the truth had finally spoken for itself. I wasn't the maid. I wasn't the burden. I was the foundation of this home, the quiet strength that held it together. As I sat one evening on the porch, watching the sun dip low and paint the sky in colors too beautiful for words, my son came to sit beside me. "Mom," he said softly, "thank you for everything. I promise, I'll never let anyone make you feel small again." I smiled, my heart full. "You don't need to promise," I told him. "You've already shown me." And with that, the past no longer felt like a chain around my neck. It felt like a story, one of sacrifice, truth, and justice. Clara had lost everything she thought mattered, but I had gained something far greater: respect, dignity, and finally, my place in the home I had saved.